Ευχαριστώ πολύ, Φωτεινή. Σας ευχαριστώ για την υπέροχη φιλοξενία εδώ στην Θεσσαλονίκη. Βλέπω ότι υπάρχουν διερμηνείς, ακριβώς. Μπορώ να μιλήσω την μητρική μου γλώσσα. Είναι τα αγγλικά. Εντάξει. Just asking if, since we have interpreters, I can continue in my mother tongue, which is English. Well, I hope that's what I said anyway. The first part of my speech is entitled Reports of the Death of the Trainer Have Been Greatly Exaggerated. So I'd like to talk about how we isolate skills and roles in interpreter training, picking up on our keynote speaker Killian's distinction into these four categories of the self, the peer, the tutor, and the trainer, which I think are very useful reference points, but you won't be surprised to hear I'm going to try and subvert them slightly. I would like to use the image of the big picture and the small picture. So you can have an overview of what you're trying to do, which is useful, but it's also useful to isolate specific skills and roles as part of that. So the big picture is we've got a real-life communication exercise, some human beings trying to communicate with others, not an artificial classroom. So to take the example here, if you're training Greek A interpreters to do English B, you've got a room full of people who all have the same language combination. And so why do you need interpreters in the first place? It actually ends up being a sort of competition to see who's got the best English or who misses out the fewest details, and a competition that hopefully your trainer will win because they have more experience. But where's the motivation in that? And obviously, the motivation is to have a pure customer, which is an isolated role. And you might need an expert trainer to think about the bigger picture and organize the contribution of the pure customer, but you don't need to be an expert trainer to play the role of pure customer. If a trainer trains a beginner interpreter in the first week to do active listening and to have intellectual rigor, then that peer will be as good as an expert trainer at playing the pure customer in week 2 of the course. And that means that the peer is as good as the expert for this specific role, and even the self is as good as the expert for this specific role. Because if you record yourself doing a consecutive and play it back, and you listen actively and analyze rigorously, then what's the added value of the trainer? The expert trainer is not a better pure customer. The added value of the expert trainer is that the trainer sees the bigger picture. The trainer can coordinate a dialogue between the pure customer and the content expert, for instance, the monitor, or a professional interpreter who has the same language combination and can put the challenges of the source speech into perspective so that you get a perspective on the task, you situate the task. So I would take that approach to isolation of roles and apply it to the issue of online resources. You can have excellent online source speeches from somewhere like the Skeek repository. You can have an excellent masterclass, for instance, from somewhere like Skeek Train, perhaps. Does all of this render the expert trainer redundant? We've got international examples of best practice, dare I say it, ORCIT some of the time, hopefully. Put that on in the classroom. Job done. You don't need to train students anymore. You've got international best practice on your computer, right? Well, you won't be too surprised to hear that my answer to that question is no, which brings me to the second part of my speech, which is entitled Gourmet versus Buffet. And it's perhaps because my own surname has a silent T that I'm so fond of those words. So Perret's Guide to Gourmets versus Buffets. So first of all, is there a contradiction between a gourmet and a meal and a buffet? Not necessarily. You can have a gourmet buffet, right? Just because it's presented as a buffet doesn't mean the food is less good quality than in a gourmet restaurant, right? You agree? So it's the fact that it's presented in a different way. It's not intrinsically necessarily a different quality. Now, the reason I chose the image of the buffet is that I think it's one that interpreters are familiar with. You've just been to one. You've no doubt been to many. You may grab too much from the buffet and be a little bit too quick to get to the buffet. And then on arriving at the buffet, think, oh no, in a minute, hundreds of delegates. Think, oh no, in a minute, hundreds of delegates are going to arrive and take all the good stuff. So I'd better grab the good stuff now. So they grab the lasagna and the chocolate cake. And then, oh look, there's pickled herring as well. And they go back to the table and then complain that the chocolate cake tastes of vinegar. Why does the chocolate cake taste of vinegar, Matthew? As a gourmet, you'll take a different approach. You'll be the hunter-gatherer who goes out and sources the ingredients, working by hand, cooking the meal yourself, serving it, putting your hand on the tummy of your guests to make sure that the digestion is happening properly. Right? So that's the expert trainer. The big picture, you've got an objective, you've got an overview, and you do it all properly. Perfect. But does the gourmet really have to do all of that by hand? Couldn't the gourmet use a combine harvester for some of the harvesting, use some equipment in the kitchen, use some medical technology to monitor digestive processes rather than actually putting his hand on the guests' tummies? It's not going to make the overall effect any less good as long as the gourmet still has his objective and his overview in mind, right? So that's the important thing that it boils down to. And that's actually independent of whether you're using technology or not. That's my first point. And it's also independent of the quality, in a sense, or at least it's a different issue to the quality of each individual element. So, have you ever had a nouveau riche friend invite you round for a meal when they've bought fancy ingredients, but they're a terrible cook? That ever happened to anyone? So, how was the meal? Well, nothing special, but those ingredients were really expensive. Well, yes, but sun-dried tomatoes have a very strong flavour. You need to know how to use them in the kitchen. And conversely, you could be a great cook, but not really discriminate about what kind of ingredients you find. And that can lead to disaster. You can't spot poisonous mushrooms. So you cook a delicious meal which kills all your guests. I can hear you cry, that's all very interesting, Matthew, and it's making me feel hungry, but what's the connection to ORCIT? So, the connection, I hope you'll see through the analogy, is a sequential pedagogical structure. So an attempt to replicate some of the expert trainer role that I was describing. You can't force users to follow a structure. So the same as the Skeek repository has the slightly subjective element of grading speeches and saying what they're useful for and when they're useful, you can't actually make people use them at the appropriate time. And a similar thing happens with ORCIT. The bookshelf is there, and it is quite explicit. And in fact, I hope it's so explicit that when on week 2 of your course you click on Advanced Simultaneous Techniques and you hear a voice saying, well, you will remember that we said in the introduction, then you might think, oops, I'm doing this in the wrong order. I hope. But like I say, you can't actually force people to do things. And there's another danger, which is the implied authority that a resource like this can have because of where it comes from and what it claims to be. And that implied authority can lead to a perception that this can somehow substitute for real-life training and expertise. In other words, you've got students going crazy at the buffet before they really know what they're doing, and their chocolate cake is getting covered in vinegar and lasagna. So looking at the different uses that it can be put to, I think there are potential avenues to explore that we'll be discussing in future with how we structure ORCIT, whether some of the sort of obligation to follow a structure could be played around with, because I've described why it's so useful. But if another function is self-study or reinforcing something or going back over something that you've already done, or a trainer looking at something, I do that myself. It can sometimes be a bit frustrating that if I want to look at subpoint D of a list, that I have to listen to my own voice finishing subpoint C before I'm allowed to go on to subpoint D. So I imagine how annoying that must be for everyone else when it's not even their own voice. And there's also the issue of whether you can match source speeches to modules. And there was a consultation exercise from Skeek earlier in the year about the possibility of having some sort of platform which brings together different online resources to try to guide people as to what to use when, and ORCIT's contribution to that was to start a discussion about how to link speeches, the source speeches, to the pedagogical stage that you're at on a course, because there's a lot of theory out there about that, but the way the interactivity of the resources online works at present, I fear, is still a bit more like a buffet than the gourmet tasting menu, where you ask the waiter, would it be sacrilegious to put mustard on this? And he says, yes, it would be sacrilegious. You're not having the mustard. I know best. I know what's in that sauce. So, like I said, it's put to different uses, which is another complicating factor for deciding how the interactivity should work. The classroom, and we heard Michelle talk about how she uses ORCIT in the flipped classroom. So you do the theory first, instead of giving a class and then saying, here's your bibliography or reading list, read up a bit more on this. You say, take a look at these resources and then come to the class with some informed ideas about what we're going to be doing in practice. But there's also the self-study role. People use it as a complement to their studies, and the fact that it's user-controlled has been described as an advantage by some students. You can go back over particular areas, dwell on them, skip over others. And I'd like to thank all those of you who came to the student workshop yesterday morning for the contributions that you made on that, which have been very helpful to us. And it's also got a role in curriculum design, because it's so sequential. I hope that it can also give some inspiration, and indeed Michelle mentioned that too, for the curriculum design of the course that she teaches on, as to how you actually organise your teaching over a year. So I've looked a little bit into the future discussions that we'll be having. Now I'll go back very quickly to the past to introduce the second part of this section. So we were trainers who were thinking about a lot of these aspects and got together. We had a fairly clear idea about what we wanted to do, and it was building on things like the NNI in the UK, which have already been mentioned. But we weren't so clear about how to actually achieve that. And my role was for project pedagogy, which I'm slightly self-conscious about using as a term. Well, I'd be self-conscious about using it in the UK, because not many people know what pedagogy means, as opposed to just teaching things. But I'm self-conscious about using it here for a very different reason, which is that I don't think it's quite right in Greek, is it? It's because we're teaching adults, not children. So it should be andragogy or something. We were linguists and trainers, and what we needed to get to that next stage of making it happen online was an expert in learning technologies. And that's where the wonderful Dragos came in, as he will come into this conference very shortly. He's also a linguist and also a trainer, so he also knows about andragogy, and he understood what it was that we wanted to achieve. But he's also an expert in learning technologies, so unlike me, for instance, he actually stood a chance of achieving it online. So that was the first part of the journey, if you like, and we're going to hear from Dragos now. I don't know whether you want to take questions now or at the end.
I think we should, yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd never thought, either as an interpreter or as a trainer, that I was so closely associated with so much food. So that was really very new and a very different perspective. You gave us a very different and very interesting perspective. And I'm And I'm also sure that you gave our interpreters a really hard time. I don't know if we did have. It would have been hell for me.